Welcome to The Explainer. Let's jump right into a really fascinating, highly structured analysis. We're looking at psychologist Jordan Peterson to break down of a massively influential document, the Communist Manifesto. Now, no matter your personal politics, what we're doing today is just objectively walking through how this source lecture deconstructs the foundational axioms of Marxist theory. Let's get right into it.
The whole premise of Peterson's lecture really boils down to this idea. He's not just blindly tossing the text aside, he's reading it, taking it apart sentence by sentence, and pressure testing its core assumptions. He's basically asking, are these actual self-evident truths, or just hypotheses that totally fall apart in the real world? The goal here is to separate the wheat from the chaff, to find what might be true, and spot where things go terribly wrong.
To do that, we've got a pretty tight roadmap. We'll breeze through the critical thinking approach, reassess the class struggle, look at the danger of binary identities, unpack centralization and the proletariat, rethink the purpose of profit, and finally, look at capitalism and poverty reduction.
Starting with Section 1, the critical thinking approach and identifying conceptual errors.
Moving right along to Section 2, reassessing the class struggle and the biological roots of hierarchy.
So, here is our first major clash of ideas. On one side, you have the foundational Marxist axiom, which basically says history is strictly an economic class struggle created by capitalism. But Peterson pushes back hard on this. He argues that yes, hierarchical struggle is very real, but blaming it entirely on capitalism is drastically missing the bigger picture. I mean, hierarchies exist across the entire animal kingdom. They're a deep, biological reality that was around way before human history and definitely long before capitalism.
The lecture points out that the original text kind of completely ignores this. If you're only looking at human suffering through the lens of economics, you're missing a massive part of what makes us human. We've got our own internal malevolence to deal with, we face psychological and spiritual battles, plus we're locked in a constant struggle just to survive in a natural world that can be incredibly harsh. Peterson's critique is that Marxism almost acts like nature itself doesn't exist, treating every bit of human suffering as a totally manufactured economic problem.
And that oversimplification brings us to Section 3, the danger of binary identities, specifically the oppressor versus the oppressed.
The manifesto leans heavily into this clean, binary split. The bourgeois oppressors are entirely evil, and the working-class proletariat are entirely good. Peterson highlights this as a classic, incredibly naive trap of group identity. Assuming that all virtue is packed into one group and all evil into another is just a bad way to look at the world, because moral worth doesn't neatly align with your bank account. And history shows us that when you carve society up into these rigid, binary identities, things get incredibly dangerous.
Take the kulaks, for example. The lecture uses them to show exactly how this binary thinking plays out in reality. The kulaks were essentially peasant farmers in the Soviet Union who, over about 40 years, managed to work their way out of serfdom and build up a tiny bit of material security. But here's the catch with defining an oppressor class. That definition can be endlessly expanded. Suddenly, these relatively successful, hardworking farmers got slapped with the bourgeoisie label.
And the sequence of events that followed is just devastating. Simply because they were given this new label of oppressors, around 1.8 million kulaks were exiled and about 400,000 were killed. But the truly tragic irony here? By wiping out their most effective farmers and seizing their private property, the system essentially destroyed its own food supply. That move directly contributed to the horrific famines in the 1930s that killed around 6 million Ukrainians. It's a stark, real-world look at the catastrophic consequences of an us versus them identity system.
That takes us to Section 4, centralization and the proletariat, looking at the dictatorship axiom. So the manifesto calls for this dictatorship of the proletariat. It's a hypothetical phase where the working class violently overthrows the current system, centralizes absolutely everything, and takes total control over production. The critical question Peterson poses here is simply, how on earth is this supposed to actually work?
Well, he outlines a few reasons why this kind of centralization is doomed to fail. First off, it's a math problem. A small, centralized group literally cannot compute the infinite complexities of an entire market economy. Second, it leans on that naive assumption we just talked about, that the working class is inherently flawless. The reality is, if you hand any small group sudden absolute power, corruption is basically inevitable. And third, it assumes the folks currently running businesses, the managers and capitalists, contribute absolutely zero value through their labor, which the lecture argues is just not true.
Which pivots us to Section 5, the purpose of profit. Is it theft or a useful constraint?
The core Marxist axiom is that profit is, by definition, theft from the worker. Now, Peterson is clear here. Sure, corrupt people exist, and profit can definitely be theft in those cases. But as a fundamental rule, he argues that profit is actually a crucial reward for abstract labor. A good business owner brings value to the table through strategic thinking, enterprise management, making things more efficient, and developing new products. Plus, profit is what lets a company grow and survive when the economy takes a hit.
But there's another fascinating angle to profit in this critique. Let me read you this quote. If you allow profit to constitute a limitation on what it is that you might reasonably attempt, it provides a good constraint on wasted labor. Essentially, Peterson is saying the need to turn a profit acts like a natural guardrail. It actively stops businesses and society from pouring time and energy into really stupid, wasteful projects. If your idea is inefficient and burns through resources, the market's demand for profit will quickly shut it down.
Finally, let's move to Section 6, Capitalism and Poverty Reduction, and take a look at some empirical data.
Marxism predicts that under capitalism, the rich are just going to keep getting richer and the poor are inevitably doomed to get poorer. Peterson doesn't sugarcoat things. He fully acknowledges that capitalism creates inequality. That's a very difficult truth. But he also points out that literally no economic system in human history has ever solved inequality, communism included. The massive difference, though, is that capitalism is the only system we found that actually generates unbelievable amounts of wealth and actively lifts people out of absolute poverty.
Take a look at the historical timeline. From the year 1 AD all the way to 1800, global GDP was basically a flat line. Nobody was really getting wealthier. But then, right as moderate free market policies started taking hold over the last couple of centuries, we see this absolutely unprecedented vertical explosion of global wealth. It's like a hockey stick graph of human progress.
And to put some numbers on that, the lecture cites that from 1800 to 2017, the inflation-adjusted income for production workers skyrocketed by a factor of 40. Even for unskilled labor, it grew 16 times over. This isn't just a story about the top 1% hoarding cash. This is a massive, fundamental upgrade to the everyday worker's standard of living.
But what about the poorest of the poor? The UN actually set a goal to cut absolute global poverty, which they defined as living on just $1.90 a day, in half between 2000 and 2015. And here is an incredible fact. We hit that goal in 2012, 3 years early. The world's poorest populations are gaining wealth at a speed that is completely historically unprecedented.
The real-world translation of that wealth is staggering. Today, the child mortality rate in Africa is the same as it was in Europe back in 1952. That is a massive, monumental leap in human development happening over just a single lifetime. Peterson uses this data to make the point that if your genuine goal is to save the poorest people on Earth from starvation, free market economies are overwhelmingly the best tool we've ever had for the job.
Which leaves us with a really complex reality to chew on. If generating the kind of massive wealth needed to literally eradicate global poverty inherently results in some economic inequality, is that a trade-off we simply have to accept? The lecture suggests that ignoring this reality in the hopes of building a perfectly equal utopia has historically ended in disaster. It's a provocative question about human nature, economics, and the choices we make, and it definitely leaves us with a lot to think about as we wrap up this explainer. Thanks for hanging out with me, and keep critically testing those ideas.